Alright, so here we go again. And this is a little bit further down on page 11. Where concerns over terrorism, and these are people that we don't want, right? Where concerns over terrorism, drug trafficking, and illegal migration, notice he doesn't use the word illegal immigration, have heightened border controls throughout the world. Multinational companies, tourists, skilled migrants simultaneously enjoy greater border permeability. In other words, while certain people are meant to be kept out and they've made it a lot harder for them to get in, others, in this case, are actually it's easier to get in than it was before. I can give you an example. In my family, I had an aunt of mine. She went to China, the mainland of China, back when it first opened up, and it was not easy, not at all. You had to go to a different country before you could even go in there. Whereas I, who have a visa that goes to mainland China, I don't have to worry about where I'm going to fly to first. Typically speaking, you can fly directly now to China, although there's currently an issue with that, and that's a bigger issue. However, the idea is that there is more people going through borders than ever before, because not only have we made it harder for some to come in, we've also made it easier, especially for those who are tourists. So that's something to think about, right? And he's talking about how over time borders have become essential and that the way that things are happening have changed. So new economic, social, and political realities are producing new forms of bordering and alternative space realities manifest at the substate level. In other words, the way that people used to work was, there's this sort of national government, they are the ones who control everything. Whereas nowadays, there's a lot more localization. So, for example, the nation tells you one thing, the state has a different requirement, and the local or cities have their own laws. So there's this sort of branching off, right? Which, let's say, 300, 400 years ago, this was not considered possible because of this word sovereignty, right? People were in complete control, and you either listened to them or you didn't. This, of course, changes how we see borders in certain places, right? So, for example, places where the border exists, people think of the border in a much different way than those who might be very far away from it, right? People who live near the Canadian border see borders in a much different way. It's very interesting to see, if you ever look at it, the US Canadian border is almost wide open. There's almost no physical demarcation, um, which is very interesting considering the fact that it is technically, if we're being serious, would be another place for illegal immigration to exist on a high volume, right? So it's very interesting that the different perceptions of the significance, and, and I'm going to use a different word other than permeance, and the way that people move between geographical boundaries are not accidental. International borders have been purposely constructed in a way to appear as though they derive from some higher logic. This again is that sort of logic that says, oh, well, we made these borders for a specific purpose, for the empowerment of the world and globalization. They are, however, no more natural or logical than any other sort of place that people vote at, right? So these are all man made. Therefore, you cannot justify how they're being used. Now, this is where he goes into a different sort of connection as to here is a research paper style. So you want to write this down. This is how you write a research paper. This is a sort of what we call literature review. So literature review is where you kind of summarize some of the issues with the major issues within the field. So borders have become a hot research topic. Here's why. Since the 60s, borders were considered passive. And as we mentioned earlier in the last video, people in the USSR were kind of clumped together, right? It's a West versus East world. So the Cold War era, from the 60s to 80s, people were in a much more us versus them mentality than perhaps we are today. Today, people can be part of a communist country and still come and be part of a capitalist society. However, in the 60s, that would have been deemed nearly impossible. In fact, it probably was impossible. Several people were in the Olympics, for example, to get out of the USSR just so that they could see what the West was like. So it's very interesting how this relationship changed over time. He talks about the importance and changes between frontiers and the way things used to be versus the way they are today. Things are much more fluid today in terms of bordering and the way that borders exist than they did back then. However, there's this sort of emotional appeal of nationalism and these assumptions that we create within these sort of ideologies or ideas into people's minds, reinforced, convey a sense of historical importance on the differences of power. So, for example, people say that the U.S. border wall has always been there for a reason and a purpose. It may have increased its meaning and purpose over time because, and then they could give different examples because nowadays there are more people trying to come in and it's easier to get in than it ever was before. All right, now I'm going to kind of skip through all of this. Now, here's something very important, and this is kind of important to sociology, which is the idea of open borders. I remember in 2016, Trump argued that Hillary Clinton believed in a borderless society. That is, that we should have no borders whatsoever. We should just let everyone in. And that wasn't necessarily the case. However, there is a sense, at least globally around the world, that was once considered impossible. That is, the borders between East and West, communist and capitalist, that they could never merge. Though nowadays, we see it more often than not that countries are starting to become socialist and capitalist at the same time. People can be communist and capitalist at the same time. Things are changing, and this sort of um, fluidization, I guess you could say, of globalization has created a completely new society. Therefore, it's not just a simple of us versus them anymore. It's a here is what I think based on this. So, here's the sort of last thing that I want to point out. Borders remain significant amid the fluidity of globalization. That's exactly what I just said, right? So this is kind of something that you could write down. Because if you were going to write about the fluid part of borders, this is going to be an absolute must for you if you're writing this essay. Borders remain significant despite the fluid or moving nature of globalization. Because, and here's that word because, right? I'm telling you, this is your supporting reasons. It is the existence of borders that put the trans, cross, or breach or span in processes of going through nationalism and migration. And here's the sort of other side here, right? He's given a counter argument. Though potentially changing in nature with neoliberal capital flows and cyber community, by that we're talking about being online, right? Linkages across space, territoriality or the control of space remains everywhere and unlikely to fade anytime soon. Now, this is kind of his thesis, right? This is his sort of larger opinion or claim. This is something that you could agree or disagree with. And in essay 2, this will be a great thing to requote because it will give you the opportunity to kind of take his ideas, right? Excuse me, take their ideas because it's more than one author. Take their ideas and then use it for your own purposes, right? Do you agree with this? To what extent do you agree with this statement? Why? What are some words that stand out to you that you agree with or disagree with? those are just some things for you to think about. So, there's a lot of things going on here. So, I hope that you have learned a lot, and that's a very bordered world, and I think we definitely live in one, and I'm definitely saving this. You best believe I'm saving this. And we are good to go. Thank you so much. Good luck.